Welcome to the Toddcast, bringing you unbiased, student-created, politics-based broadcasting, made possible by the Schar School of Policy and Government. Today, we're joined by Amna, a fellow Schar USO member, and she'll be joining us to talk about Ethiopia and the current humanitarian crisis that has been developing in the Tigray region.
First, we're going to be talking about the background, and for this conflict, it has deep roots. But essentially, it's a power struggle that goes back to 2018, when a popular uprising brought Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, a Nobel Peace Laureate, to power. He ushered in democratic reforms and negotiated an end to what could have been a Cold War with neighboring Eritrea. But he also dismantled Ethiopia's ruling party, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or the EPRDF, which had run the country for almost 30 years. The EPRDF, which appointed Abiy, was a coalition of ethnically based political parties. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, dominated the coalition and had amassed a lot of power as an ethnic minority. Tigrayans made up about 6% of Ethiopia's population. When Abiy sidelined them, TPLF leaders retreated to their home region in northern Ethiopia. Since then, Abiy has accused them of trying to destabilize the country. In a briefing document sent to journalists on Thursday, his office directly accused the TPLF of orchestrating ethnic violence across the country. Hidden hands of the TPLF were there in the killings of civilians in many different parts of the country, the document read. It cited intelligence but didn't provide evidence. The TPLF has in the past denied similar accusations. Regardless, the violence has displaced more than 3 million people over the past 2 years, according to the International Displacement Monitoring Center. But things worsened dramatically once COVID-19 hit Ethiopia, the African continent's second largest country by population. Abiy was supposed to guide the country through its first truly democratic elections this summer, but citing the pandemic, he postponed them. The TPLF argued that this amounted to an unconstitutional extension of the federal government's term, so they defied Abiy's orders, created their own electoral commission, and held their own regional elections. The federal government declared the Tigray elections unconstitutional, and both sides began trading accusations of illegitimacy. Abiy said the TPLF crossed a red line on the week of November 11th when it allegedly organized a multi-pronged attack on the Ethiopian military's northern command, a treason that will not be forgotten, Abiy said. The TPLF denied the attack. On its television station after the fighting broke out, the region's president, Debretsion Gebremichael, called the dialogue. In a letter to the African Union, he accused the government of a power grab and accused Abiy of imprisoning his opponents and trying to turn Ethiopia's ethnic federalism into a system where the prime minister holds all the power. Dr. Abiy Ahmed's one-man dictatorial regime has started to unravel the constitutionally established state institutions, he wrote. He is also endangering the unity of this ancient country.
Now we're going to discuss how serious the fighting is. An average of 4,000 women, men, and children have crossed the border into eastern Sudan every day since November 10th, the agency said. In total, more than 27,000 people have now traveled into Sudan at 3 border locations, UNHCR spokesperson Babar Baloch said at a news conference in Geneva. Refugees fleeing the fighting continue to arrive exhausted from the long trek to safety with few belongings, Baloch added. UNHCR, with its partners, is supporting the Sudanese government in its response, ramping up humanitarian assistance at the borders as the needs continue to grow. After announcing that it was, quote, at war with the TPLF, the federal army has since stepped up its military offensive, carrying out airstrikes as part of Prime Minister and Nobel laureate Ahmed's, quote, law enforcement operation, which has led to clashes across the area. Across the border in Sudan, refugees from Tigray are arriving exhausted with few belongings, said the UNHCR. In the border town of Hamadiyat, clean water is available and latrines are being built, but the agency says it's concerned about hygiene conditions as thousands of more people continue to arrive on a daily basis. Other humanitarian organizations are also distributing relief items, including blankets and sleeping mats, according to the UNHCR. The World Food Programme is providing high-protein biscuits while hot meals are being distributed by Muslim Aid. A prolonged conflagration between well-armed factions inside of Ethiopia could send hundreds of thousands of refugees across borders, disrupt trade routes, and force Addis Ababa to abandon its role of regional anchor state, mediator, policeman, and peacekeeper. That would be a potentially cataclysmic scenario for a region ill-equipped to handle additional tumult or a humanitarian fallout that could affect more than 9 million people, according to the UN this week. Nowhere are the threats of instability more acute than in neighboring Sudan, which 2 days after the fighting announced a closure of portions of its eastern border with Ethiopia, and reportedly began positioning more than 6,000 of its own forces inside of Gidaraf state, which borders Tigray. Anecdotal reports from inside Sudan suggest that the normally heavy volume of trade at border checkpoints has already been curtailed, and that Tigrayan truck drivers are being prevented from bringing their shipments into Sudan out of the fear that federal authorities in Addis could see this as an effort to aid in the Tigrayan resistance. In Tigray, a lack of electricity, telecommunications, and access to fuel and cash is hampering humanitarian efforts and making it difficult to verify information about attacks in the region.
So now we're going to be talking about the current situation 1 month in. Ethiopian forces have taken full control of Mekelle, the capital of the restive Tigray region, ending a 3-week military conflict. The military has gained control of the airport, public institutions, and regional administrative offices, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said in a statement. The armed forces also secured the Northern Command military camp, releasing thousands of Ethiopian soldiers held captive by the military force loyal to the Tigrayan ruling party. The main operation is successfully concluded, Abiy said on Twitter. We now have ahead of us the critical task of rebuilding what has been destroyed, repairing what is damaged, returning those who have fled, with utmost priority of returning normalcy to the people of the Tigray region. Fierce fighting had broken out in Mekelle on Saturday, the eyewitness said, 2 days after Abiy warned the country had entered the final phase of a law enforcement military operation in the northern restive region of the Tigray after a 72-hour deadline to surrender expired. A humanitarian corridor will be open in both directions, according to a statement from the federal government's State of Emergency Task Force. There have been reports of atrocities committed by federal forces since Abiy ordered airstrikes and a ground offensive against Tigray's rulers for defying his authority. Tigrayan leaders have accused federal forces of killing innocent civilians while targeting churches and homes. In a tweet on Saturday, Belen Seyum, a spokesperson for Abiy, said, "The victim hero narrative describing the TPLF fighters is a grave denial of justice for millions of Ethiopians. A communications blackout in the region has made reporting on claims from both sides difficult. International leaders have expressed grave concern for the disruption of humanitarian access and for violence against civilians during fighting in Mekelle. About 500,000 residents live in the capital city, half of whom are children, according to UNICEF." Abiy met with Cyril Ramaphosa, president of South Africa and chairperson of the African Union, along with other union envoys, from Wednesday to Friday. He told them the operation would not last long and that citizens who had fled would be resettled, according to a statement from the African Union. The federal government said on Saturday it appreciates the concern of the international community and that civilians were not targeted during the operation. 3 Ethiopia Red Cross ambulances have been attacked since the clashes began, and hospitals in northern Ethiopia are in urgent need of medical supplies, said the International Committee of the Red Cross on Friday. The number of people internally displaced inside Tigray is growing daily, and some pre-existing refugee camps in the region only have food supplies to last 3 days, according to the UNHCR. The UNHCR High Commissioner Filippo Grandi is in Sudan until Sunday to meet with government officials and partners, along with visits to refugee camps. "I urge Ethiopian leaders to do everything possible to protect civilians, uphold human rights, and ensure humanitarian access," UN Security General Antonio Guterres tweeted on Wednesday.
Now we're going to be talking about the potential steps going forward. The ICRC said the Ethiopian Red Cross ambulances had taken injured and deceased people to the Idar Referral Hospital. On a visit to the hospital, ICRC staff found 80% of patients to be suffering from trauma injuries, adding that other services had to be suspended so that limited staff and resources could be devoted to emergency medical care. The hospital is running dangerously low in sutures, antibiotics, anticoagulants, painkillers, and even gloves, ICRC head in Ethiopia, Maria Soledad, said. The hospital is also running low on body bags for the deceased, the Geneva-based organization said. The ICRC, however, did not give any figures for the numbers injured or dead. Neither did it say whether the victims were civilians or military personnel. In a text message to Reuters, TPLF leader Debretsion Michael did not directly comment on the situation on the ground, but said of the government forces, their brutality can only add to our resolve to fight these invaders to the last. He added, "This is about defending our right to self-determination." Mr. Debretsion's whereabouts are unknown. A TPLF statement read out on regional Tigray TV said, "Fascistic bombings have caused civilian deaths and injuries. The Tigray government has vowed that it would take retaliatory actions against the barbaric bombings." Analysts say the TPLF could now be preparing to return to the mountains to launch a guerrilla war against the federal government. The UN had warned of possible war crimes if the Ethiopian army attacked Mekelle. It has also expressed concerns about the lack of access for humanitarian workers. The Ethiopian authorities said on Thursday that they were committed to work with UN agencies to protect civilians and those who need it. Also on Thursday, Ethiopian troops were deployed along Tigray's border with Sudan, preventing people fleeing the violence from leaving the country, according to refugees.
This story has been very interesting to cover because I don't think we've seen any news about it, at least in the United States. And it's a huge humanitarian issue that I don't think enough people are discussing.
Yeah, I agree. I was about to say that before this, I wasn't really aware on this crisis, and I haven't really seen it on social media, on the news, and it hasn't been given much coverage. So I do believe that a lot of people aren't aware of this crisis, and I for sure wasn't aware of it as well. And that's just kind of interesting to see how it wasn't really broadcasted on television or on social media.
This is also a developing situation and story, and so as time goes on, it's going to be really interesting to see how the story progresses, but also knowing that information is really limited coming out of the country to the United States and other countries internationally. I wonder like how accurate the description is in terms of the amount of people who are displaced and how many people have been injured and dead, like how those numbers will change over time as more information is able to leave the borders.
Yes, Imani makes a good point, especially considering that in these kinds of situations, there are a lot of people, especially living under poverty, who are not accounted for. So we have really no idea what the true number is. And as far as the UN goes and as far as the ICRC goes, there's really only so much we can do. And when it comes to like my knowledge about the ICRC personally, there's very little enforcement that goes along with this. I mean, there are international humanitarian laws that sort of provide a guideline, if you will, on how to treat civilians or non-combatants and what is expected. But when it comes to actually enforcing a lot of this, it's nearly impossible, especially in situations where it's already rife, and trying to establish rules and trying to regulate something like this in the middle of a war, essentially, it's nearly impossible. And unfortunately, the people who are hurting the most are the innocent civilians who are just getting caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, and this situation as like major as it is, it's really only been going on for the last month, and so the amount of damage and the amount of like progress that the conflict has had in such a short amount of time, as we move into the end of the year, like I wonder whether it'll be progressing, since the Ethiopian government has largely said that they've squashed the rebellion, but the TPLF have not really like said that they've like surrendered or anything. And so going forward, really there's a large amount of scenarios that could happen. And so I really hope other news sources pick this up and keep an eye on the situation, because it really is important and could go any way at any time.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious to see how the conflict's going to play out, especially with more media coverage. And since it's only been a month, I'm curious to see what happens and how they cover the story, how news sources cover the story, and yeah, it'd just be interesting to look at that.
We also have to consider the fact that it might not ever get covered at all. I mean, we're also in the middle of a pandemic, and there's a lot going on within the US on its own. And sort of these international stories tend to be covered, not given as much attention. But honestly, the people who benefit most from this coverage are the refugees, because then people will, be able to donate to them. And they're all fleeing to Sudan, which is not a very stable country as it is. And so they, like we said, they're very ill-equipped to handle the refugees. So our hope is that this story gets more and more coverage, because it will really help all of the people who are displaced. I mean, so far we've got 27,000 people who have nothing. They don't, nothing but the clothes on their backs. And so they definitely need our help.
Yeah, the note that refugees are fleeing to Sudan, that is what really piqued my knowledge that this is like a really dire situation, because as Miriam was saying, like Sudan's not doing too great in terms of stability within themselves as well. And so going forward, like Amna said, like there probably won't be as much coverage that as like the situation probably should have, just based on like how little there has been in the last month. Because like doing research on this topic, there was information out there, but it was also fairly scattered and really was only being updated like sporadically. And that's, I think, partly due to the amount of information being able to come out of Ethiopia, but also partly due to like Western media's like need and want to like sensationalize different stories. And this story, I guess, just wasn't as quote unquote interesting to make apparent to a more widespread audience. But yeah, it's serious. And like I think we just thought it was necessary to bring it to your attention if you weren't able to see it in other different news outlets.
As always, all the information we used in this episode and more will be available in the description below, in case you want to help out or in case you want to educate yourself a little bit more on this topic. You can also find our social media there. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, so please feel free to leave a comment and tell us what you think. I'd like to thank Amna so much for joining us today. It's been really awesome to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking about Ethiopia and learning more about the crisis. So thank you so much for having me as a guest on the podcast.
All right, and that's a wrap. Thank you guys so much for listening. Unfortunately, this is going to be our last episode this semester, but we appreciate all the love and support that we've gotten while creating this podcast. It truly meant a lot to us. We hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as we enjoyed making it. And thank you to our wonderful guests who have joined our conversations. It's been awesome to have you guys. And we hope you guys have a great rest of your year and happy holidays. We can't wait to talk to you guys again soon. Bye.
Bye.